She always said she was working late. But then why did I find her phone full of messages from a stranger? The look in her eyes when I asked her about it was like a knife to my back. I started noticing more. The missing hours, unexpected calls, her reluctance to speak openly. The private investigator brought me evidence that knocked the ground out from under my feet. She lied. Her secrets not only shattered my trust, but also put everything I had built at risk. But this wasn't just infidelity. What I discovered changed everything. Are you ready to find out how it all ended? Revenge, lies, and redemption. The day my cheating wife's plan fell apart, Jack woke up earlier than usual, though he had barely slept all night. His mind buzzed with thoughts of Brian Howlett, whom Detective Blake had mentioned. Deciding not to delay, he quickly got ready and headed to Brian's office. When Jack entered the building where Howlett's company was located, he was overcome by a strange sense of unease. The receptionist, a young woman with a flawless smile, greeted him warmly. "How can I help you?" "I'd like to meet with Mr. Howlett," Jack replied, trying to keep calm. The woman nodded and asked him to wait for a moment. A few minutes later, Brian's assistant approached him and invited him into the office. When the door opened, Jack saw Brian, a tall, imposing man in a perfectly tailored suit. His confidence and calm demeanor only irritated Jack further. "Mr. Ryan," Brian stood and extended his hand. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person." Jack ignored his gesture and sat down opposite him. "You know why I'm here," Jack said bluntly. Brian raised an eyebrow and smiled. "I think I can guess," he replied, "but it would be better if you said it out loud." "You're seeing my wife," Jack began, feeling his voice start to tremble. "Who are you to her?" Brian leaned forward, his smile disappearing. "Let's be honest, Jack," he said coldly. "You already know there's been something wrong in your marriage for a long time. Megan isn't happy, and you can feel it." Those words were like a slap in the face. Jack didn't know how to respond. He clenched his teeth, trying not to lose control. "That doesn't give you the right to destroy our marriage," he said, each word landing like a shot. Brian smiled again, but this time it was tense. "I'm not destroying anything. I'm just helping her find what you stopped giving her a long time ago," he replied. Jack stood abruptly, but Brian raised a hand to stop him. "Sit down," he ordered. "I know more than you think, Jack. Do you want to know what's really going on? Fine, I'll tell you." Brian reached into a drawer and pulled out several photographs. They showed Jack and Megan, but they seemed to capture their worst moments. In one, Jack was yelling. In another, he was breaking something in the kitchen. Jack recognized these moments, but couldn't understand how or who had captured them. "What is this?" he asked, his voice filled with anger. "This is your life, Jack? And she came to me because she couldn't take it anymore," Brian replied. Jack felt his anger boiling over, but along with it came fear. Fear that Brian was right, and that he himself had driven Megan into his arms. "Are you spying on me?" Jack asked, trying to keep control. Brian shook his head. "Not me. But believe me, I know more than you think. And if you want to protect yourself, I'd advise you to think twice before making any moves." Jack rose to his feet. "This isn't over," he said, staring directly into Brian's eyes. "I'll find out the truth." He left the office, his heart pounding so hard he could barely think. Brian knew something more, and it made Jack even more nervous. Jack felt the tension rise as he dialed Detective Blake's number. His hand trembled, and his heart pounded like a drum. After a few rings, a voice answered. "Blake speaking." "It's Jack Ryan," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need your help. I've found something, or someone, and I need to understand what's behind this." The detective didn't ask unnecessary questions over the phone. "Let's meet today at 5 in my office. Does that work for you?" "Yes, thank you," Jack replied shortly and hung up. The detective's office was in a quiet area, hidden from prying eyes. Jack entered the small space, where he was greeted by Blake, grim and focused as always. "What do you have?" he asked, motioning for Jack to sit. Jack pulled out the photographs Brian had shown him. They were grainy, taken from a distance, but clear enough to convey their emotional weight. "Brian didn't take these," Jack said, "but he knew about them. He even told me I should think carefully before making any moves." Blake slowly looked through the photographs, his stony expression unchanged. "This is professional work," he remarked. "These shots were taken with good equipment. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." Jack felt his mouth go dry. "Can you find this person? Figure out who's behind it?" Blake nodded. "But it'll take time. And you need to be prepared for the fact that the results might be unexpected." "Worse than this?" Jack pointed to the photographs. The detective looked up, pausing in thought before replying. "You don't know how deep this rabbit hole might go." The next day, Jack received Blake's first report. The detective had determined that the photos were taken from a distance, suggesting the use of specialized equipment, possibly a camera with a concealed lens. He had also found indications that Megan might have known about them. That evening, Jack returned home and saw Megan cooking dinner. She acted as usual, but now he knew there was more behind her facade. "How was your day?" she asked, not looking up as she chopped vegetables. "Not bad," he replied curtly, sitting at the table. "Is there something you want to tell me?" She looked up, her expression genuinely surprised. "Like what?" Jack pulled out the photographs and placed them on the table in front of her. Her face changed instantly. She went pale, her hands trembling slightly. "What's this?" she asked, trying to remain calm. "That's what I want to ask you," Jack replied. "Who did this and why?" Megan looked at him with an indescribable fear. I don't know who it could have been," she said, but her voice betrayed her lie. Jack felt his patience snap. "You don't know? Then why do you look like you've been caught red-handed?" She sighed and lowered her gaze. "Jack, it's complicated to explain." "Try," he replied coldly. "Because otherwise I'll find out myself." Jack sat at the kitchen table, watching as Megan nervously twisted a napkin in her hands. Her pale face betrayed her fear, though she tried to speak calmly. "You don't understand," she began, trying to meet his gaze. I found out about these pictures by accident." Jack leaned forward, clenching his fists. "By accident?" he asked skeptically. "And you didn't think to tell me? Or were you waiting for it to blow up?" "No," she responded quickly. "I was scared. Scared you wouldn't believe me." "Believe what?" Jack asked coldly. "That someone decided to spy on us? On me? On you?" Megan lowered her head, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I think it's Robert." Jack froze. The name of his best friend hit like a thunderclap in the silence. "Robert? You're joking." His voice turned dangerously quiet. "Why would he do this?" Megan held her breath, her eyes glistening with tears. "Because he's always been jealous of you. Always trying to prove he's better. I've seen the way he looks at me, how he tries to get closer to you." Jack leaned back in his chair, his thoughts spinning in chaos. Robert, his closest friend, someone he trusted as much as himself. And now this? "This is absurd," he finally said. "Robert would never do something like this. We've been through so much together." "Are you sure about that?" Megan looked up, her voice filled with pain. "Because I'm not." Jack couldn't sleep that night. He went through the photographs over and over, trying to find something that could confirm or disprove Megan's words. His heart tore between anger and doubt. If this was true, if Robert was really involved in this, then who could be trusted anymore? The next morning, he called Detective Blake again. "We need to talk," he said when Blake picked up. "What happened?" The detective asked shortly. "My wife says it could be my friend. I want to know if you have any evidence to support that." Blake was silent for a few seconds. "I was just about to call you. I found something interesting, but it's better discussed in person. Come by at 2. At the detective's office, Blake presented Jack with new evidence, payment records for surveillance equipment rentals made from Robert's account. Jack felt his world begin to crack. "This can't be true," he murmured. "He's my friend." The evidence says otherwise," Blake interrupted. "And I think you need to talk to him." Jack met with Robert that evening at the bar where they often spent time together. Robert looked the same as always, smiling, relaxed. But now Jack saw something unnatural in his demeanor. "How are you?" Robert asked, taking a sip of his beer. "I have a question." Jack got straight to the point. "And I want an honest answer." Robert tilted his head, his smile fading. "What's going on?" Jack placed copies of the payment records on the table. "Was this you?" he asked quietly. "Were you spying on me?" Robert went pale but quickly composed himself. It's not what you think, he began, but Jack interrupted him. Then explain. Why do these records lead to you? Why did you rent surveillance equipment? Robert fell silent. His eyes darted, searching for an escape. I wanted to protect you, he finally said. I thought she was cheating on you, and I wanted to find proof. Jack felt anger boiling in his chest. And that's why you didn't tell me? You decided it was better to act behind my back? Robert didn't reply. His silence was louder than any words. Jack returned home after meeting with Robert, his thoughts chaotic. Cutting ties with his friend seemed like the only right thing to do, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that Robert knew more than he was letting on. When he entered the house, Jack noticed the light in his study was on. Megan usually never went in there. He approached the door cautiously and heard the faint rustling of papers. Opening the door, he saw Megan hastily trying to hide some documents in a drawer. What are you doing in here? Jack asked, watching her nervous movements. Megan spun around, her face tense. Just looking for the electricity bills, she replied, attempting a smile. But her smile was fake. Jack stepped closer, his gaze cold. In my study? In a drawer where I never keep them. Megan held her breath, trying to come up with a convincing explanation. Jack wasn't willing to wait for another lie. He walked over to the drawer and yanked it open. Inside were the same photographs he had shown her earlier, along with several documents he hadn't seen before. What's this? He asked, picking up one of the sheets. Megan remained silent, her face pale. You knew about this. You knew and kept it from me. Jack's voice grew louder. Jack, it's not what you think, she finally said. I wanted to protect us. Protect us? He repeated sarcastically. This looks more like a conspiracy. Megan took a step back, as if afraid of his reaction. I didn't know how to tell you. Robert. He knows more than you think. And I thought I could handle it myself. What does he know? Jack demanded, his patience already stretched thin. He knows about us, about what happened a few years ago. She confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack froze. A few years ago? His mind raced, trying to recall what could have been so significant to be hidden for so long. Explain, he croaked. Megan sat down on a chair, her hands trembling. It's about your company, she began. One of your projects. It wasn't as clean as you thought. Robert knew about it, and he used it to blackmail me. Jack couldn't believe what he was hearing. Are you saying he spied on us to keep you in fear? He asked. Why didn't you tell me? I was scared, she replied, her voice breaking. Scared you'd hate me for dragging you into this. Jack stood in silence, staring at her. His anger mingled with disappointment and a sense of betrayal. He realized that everything he thought was true had been an illusion. This isn't over, he finally said. I'll talk to Robert. And if he's really involved in this, he'll pay for everything. Megan said nothing, just nodded with her head down. Jack stood outside the cafe where he had arranged to meet Robert. His heart pounded, and his thoughts raced between anger, despair, and a burning desire to uncover the truth. Whatever it was, this time he was determined to get to the bottom of it. When Jack entered, Robert was already sitting at a table in the far corner, calmly sipping coffee. He looked relaxed, but Jack knew him well enough to see the tension in his movements. Robert glanced up from his phone and raised a hand in greeting. Jack, he said as Jack approached. Glad you came. Are you really? Jack shot back sharply, sitting down across from him. I'm here because you need to explain to me what the hell is going on. Robert sighed and set his cup aside. I understand you're angry, but if you'll let me explain. Explain? Jack interrupted, leaning forward. Explain why you were spying on me, why your name shows up in the detective's reports, and what exactly is going on between you and Megan. Robert stayed calm, though his jaw tightened. Fine, he said, holding Jack's gaze. But you won't believe me right away. It's complicated. Try me, Jack replied coldly. Robert nodded, choosing his words carefully. Your projects, Jack. One of them, the one you launched 3 years ago. There were issues. Legal, financial. I found out through one of my contacts. At the time, I didn't want to get involved, but things got complicated. Jack froze, staring at Robert in disbelief. Are you saying I did something illegal? He asked, his voice dangerously low. Maybe you didn't know about it, Robert quickly added. But someone on your team signed deals that weren't ethically clean. It drew attention. Jack felt his throat tighten. He couldn't believe it. His company had always been a model of integrity, or so he thought. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He asked through gritted teeth. Because it wasn't my business, Robert replied. But then Megan got involved. She found out through someone on your team and came to me for help. Megan? Jack repeated, stunned. What does she have to do with this? Robert lowered his eyes to his cup, then looked back at Jack. She wanted to protect you, but it made things worse. One of the people working on your project started blackmailing her, and that's why she asked me to get involved. Jack leaned back in his chair, trying to process what he had just heard. His wife, his company, his friend. It all felt like pieces of a larger conspiracy. Do you have proof? He finally asked. Robert nodded and pulled a folder from his bag. Inside were phone records, copies of contracts, and even a few photographs Jack hadn't seen before. This is everything I've gathered, Robert said. And there's more. The person behind this could be very dangerous. You need to be careful. Jack slowly flipped through the documents, feeling his world crumble. Why are you helping me now? He asked. Because you're my friend, Robert replied. And I can't stand by and watch you destroy your life over this. Jack didn't know whether to believe him, but one thing was certain. This story was far from over. Jack returned home late that evening, his thoughts chaotic after the conversation with Robert. He walked into the living room and saw Megan sitting on the couch, hugging herself. She looked exhausted, but there was something more in her eyes, a shadow of fear and despair. We need to talk, he said without greeting her. Megan looked up, her lips trembling as if she had been preparing for this moment. I know, she replied softly. Jack sat across from her, leaning forward, his gaze sharp and probing. Robert told me you knew about the issues with my projects, that you were aware of the blackmail. Are you going to deny it? Megan sighed, her shoulders slumping. No, I won't deny it, she said, her voice trembling. But there's something you need to know. It's not as simple as it seems. Then explain, Jack said coldly. Because right now, it looks like you've been part of a conspiracy this whole time. Megan bit her lip, and for a moment, it seemed she wouldn't be able to speak. But then she suddenly lifted her head, her eyes glistening with tears. It started 2 years ago, she said. One of your partners, Gerard, came to me. He said he knew something that could ruin you. He showed me documents that proved someone in your company was stealing money through fraudulent deals. Why didn't you come to me? Jack asked sharply. I was scared, she replied. Scared you wouldn't believe me. Gerard said that if I told you, he'd go public with it. He knew everything about us, Jack. And I made a mistake. What mistake? Jack's voice grew deeper, more dangerous. Megan closed her eyes, as if that could shield her from the truth she was about to reveal. I agreed to work for him. He said if I helped him find additional evidence, he'd destroy all the records and leave us alone. I didn't know it would go this far. Jack felt his anger boiling in his chest. You worked for him? You betrayed me? I was trying to protect you, she cried, tears streaming down her face. I did it to save us, Jack. But then it got worse. Gerard started demanding more. He wanted me to. To what? Jack stood up, his eyes blazing. To betray you, she whispered, her voice breaking. But I didn't. I couldn't. A deep silence fell between them, so profound that Jack could hear his own heartbeat. He felt his world shattering into tiny fragments. Why are you telling me this now? He finally asked. Because I can't keep it inside any longer, she replied. Because I know Gerard is planning something bigger, and if we don't stop him now, he'll destroy us both. Jack stood in his study, gripping his phone tightly as messages from Megan glowed on the screen. Her words echoed in his mind like a haunting refrain. Gerard had accomplices in your company. They're still working to destroy you. The news seemed too horrifying to be true. But Megan sat in the living room, her face pale, her eyes filled with tears. She didn't look like she was lying. She looked like a woman who had carried this burden for far too long. Who exactly? Jack asked as he returned to the room. His voice was firm, but inside, a storm was raging. Give me their names. Megan hugged herself, as if trying to shield herself from his anger. Gerard was working with Griffin and Bennett, she said quietly. They're your colleagues who handled finances. They devised the scheme, and Gerard just watched and kept everyone in fear. Jack felt his hands begin to tremble. Griffin and Bennett? They've been working with me for 10 years. How is that possible? Megan lifted her head, her voice breaking. They took advantage of your trust, Jack. They knew you'd never suspect them. Jack turned away to hide his anger. He wanted to call them immediately, wanted to meet face to face and force them to confess. But something in Megan's expression stopped him. There's something else you're not telling me, he said coldly. Megan swallowed hard, her arms tightening around herself. Gerard has video recordings. He recorded our conversations when I was working for him. There are things on those tapes that could ruin you, Jack. If those recordings fall into the wrong hands, it's all over. Jack froze, his breathing becoming heavy. How long have you known about this? 6 months, she admitted, her voice barely audible. This was the last straw. He picked up his phone and dialed Detective Blake. Blake, it's Jack. We need to talk. I have names and evidence. Bring them to me. The detective replied curtly. Jack hung up and looked at Megan. He didn't know if he could forgive her, but right now, there was something more important, saving what was left of his life. We're not done here, he said before leaving. Jack walked into Blake's office, tension coursing through every cell in his body. The detective was seated at his desk, surrounded by stacks of papers and photographs. His face was serious, which only heightened Jack's anxiety. Take a seat, Jack, Blake said without looking up from the documents. We've got a serious problem. What did you find? Jack asked, sitting across from him. His hands were clenched into fists, and he was barely holding himself together. Blake finally looked up and pulled a few photographs from the pile of papers. These are documents we uncovered during our investigation. They show financial transactions between Griffin, Bennett, and Gerard himself. This isn't just about fake deals. They were working together to embezzle money, using your company as cover. Jack froze, staring at the photographs. This was worse than he could have imagined. Are you saying all 3 of them were in on it? He asked, his voice barely audible. Exactly, Blake confirmed. And there's more. I discovered that Gerard wasn't just an intermediary. He was coordinating the entire operation. And it seems Megan became a victim of his manipulation. Jack stood up, his hands trembling with rage. How did he do it? How did he manage to hide this from me? Blake sighed and shrugged. Gerard is a master manipulator. He exploited your trust in Griffin and Bennett to create the perfect cover. And now that we've uncovered this, he'll do everything he can to destroy the evidence. Jack walked over to the window, trying to process his emotions. He felt his world falling apart. What do we do next? He finally asked. I have a plan, Blake said. But you need to be ready for the fact that this will be dangerous. We need to force Gerard to make a mistake. But for that, you'll have to play your part. I'm ready, Jack replied, turning to the detective. Tell me what I need to do. That evening, Jack returned home. Megan was waiting for him in the living room. She looked as though she knew he had learned something new. What did Blake say? She asked, not looking away. He found a connection between Griffin, Bennett, and Gerard, Jack replied. And now we know they were all working together. Megan covered her face with her hands, her shoulders trembling. I knew they were involved, but I didn't know it was this serious, she whispered. Jack, what are we going to do? We're going to make them pay, he replied coldly. But for that, you need to be honest with me. This is no time for secrets. Megan nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'll do whatever it takes, she said. Jack sat in his office, his fingers nervously tapping the edge of the desk. The late evening brought a heavy silence that felt oppressive. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Megan walked in, her face pale, her eyes glistening with worry. We need to talk, she began, her voice barely audible. Jack stood, his expression wary. What happened? He asked, already sensing that her news wouldn't be good. Megan stepped closer and, avoiding his eyes, handed him her phone. This just came through, she said. Jack took the phone. On the screen was a message from an unknown number. Gerard is planning to release the incriminating material on Jack. You have 24 hours to stop it. His heart began to race. He looked back at Megan. Where did this come from? I don't know, she replied, but it seems plausible. He's always threatened to do something if we got too close to the truth. Jack clenched his teeth. There was no time for doubt or discussion now. We need to act immediately, he said. Do you know where he is right now? Megan thought for a moment. If he's really going to do this, he might be in his office. He always works late there. Jack nodded, already forming a plan. An hour later, Jack and Megan were outside the building where Gerard's office was located. The street was dark, and the only source of light was a dim lamp near the entrance. Jack turned to Megan. Stay here. If something goes wrong, I want you to be safe. Jack, she began, but he was already through the door. Reaching the third floor, Jack heard voices coming from Gerard's office. He quietly approached and peeked through the crack in the door. Gerard was standing by his desk, speaking on the phone. I'll release it tomorrow morning. It'll ruin him, and no one will dare to stand in my way again, Gerard was saying. Jack felt his anger boil over. He decided there was no time to wait. He pushed the door open, catching Gerard off guard. Jack, Gerard exclaimed, but quickly regained his composure. How nice of you to drop by. You're not going to release it, Jack said firmly. You've played your games with me, but it's over. Gerard just smiled, pulling a flash drive from his drawer. It's all right here, he said, waving the drive. And I know there's nothing you can do to stop it. Jack took a step forward, but at that moment, the door behind him opened. It was Megan. Her presence made Gerard pause in surprise. Ah, how wonderful. The whole family is here, Gerard said sarcastically. This ends now, Gerard, Megan said. Her voice steady despite her trembling hands. We have evidence against you, and we won't let you destroy Jack. Megan stood in the center of the office, her face frozen in a mask of anxiety and confusion. Gerard circled his desk, stopping near her. His sinister smile made him appear even more dangerous. Did you really think you could walk in here and make me back down? He asked mockingly. Jack was easy enough to fool, but you knew this wouldn't end with just the incriminating material. Jack, standing behind her, felt his fists clench. He stepped forward, but Gerard raised a hand to stop him. Don't rush, Jack, Gerard continued. I want you to hear everything. All these recordings, the documents, they're just the beginning. My real target has always been her. Your perfect wife, who supposedly wanted to save you. Megan spun around sharply, her eyes blazing with anger. What are you talking about? She shouted. I was never part of your filthy games. Gerard tilted his head, his smile widening. Really? He asked. And what about the deals you signed when you worked for me? Or have you forgotten that your actions gave me the key to destroying Jack? Jack froze. His gaze locked on Megan. What is he talking about? He asked quietly. It's not true, she cried, but her voice trembled. He's manipulating you, Jack. He's always been manipulating you. Manipulating? Gerard interrupted with a laugh. You gave me everything I needed. You thought you were saving him, but in reality, you were pushing him further into the trap. Jack stepped toward Megan, his eyes filled with mixed emotions. Anger, betrayal, and pain. Megan, what does he mean? What did you do? He asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Megan broke into tears, her shoulders trembling. I thought I could control it, she whispered. When Gerard started blackmailing me, I agreed to sign a few documents. But I never thought it would go this far. She was my greatest tool, Gerard interjected. I didn't think it would work so perfectly. Her fears, her desire to save you, they all worked in my favor. Jack felt the ground beneath him shift. He took another step toward Gerard. You used her to destroy me? He asked, his fists clenched. And that's not all, Gerard continued. The next step is to release all these recordings. Your partners, your clients, even your friends. They'll all know your company was involved in corruption. And the best part is, it'll all look like it's your fault. Megan moved closer to Jack, grabbing his hand. Jack, I know I made a mistake, but you have to believe me. I only wanted to save us. Jack pulled his hand away, his expression cold and distant. Save us? He whispered. You thought lies could save our marriage? Megan cried harder, but Jack was no longer listening. His attention was fully focused on Gerard. You won't win, he said, staring directly into Gerard's eyes. I'll do everything to stop you. Gerard just smiled. You're too late, Jack, he said. The game has already begun. Jack returned home after the tense confrontation with Gerard, but he found no peace. Gerard's words echoed in his mind. You're too late. The game has already begun. He realized that he couldn't face such a powerful and well-organized conspiracy alone. He needed allies. The next day, Jack called a meeting at his office with a few former colleagues and friends he had once trusted, Griffin, Bennett, and Morgan. They had worked together for many years, but recently their relationships had become strained due to rumors of trouble within the company. Jack knew this conversation wouldn't be easy. Thank you for coming, he began once everyone was seated around the small conference room table. I know many of you have doubts about me lately, but we need to unite now. Gerard is preparing to release damaging material that could ruin not just me, but all of our reputations. Griffin was the first to break the silence, crossing his arms over his chest. And why should we trust you? He asked. After all the scandals, trust in you is at rock bottom. Jack felt his patience thinning, but forced himself to remain calm. You've known me for many years, he replied. I've always acted with integrity, but this isn't just about me anymore. If Gerard executes his plan, we'll all be in the crossfire. Morgan, the only woman in the group, leaned forward. What exactly does he have? She asked. And how can we stop it? Jack looked at her with gratitude. He has recordings, documents that can create the illusion that our company is involved in corruption. But I'm certain part of it is fabricated. We need to expose him before it reaches the press. Bennett, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. What if it's true? What if some of us really were involved in this? His voice was quiet, but his words fell like thunder. Jack froze. He looked at Bennett, then at Griffin. What do you mean? He asked, his voice tense. Bennett sighed. Some of the deals, we thought it was just standard practice. But now I realize Gerard might have used us to create these records. And if that's the case, we're all in danger. Griffin suddenly stood up. I'm not going to be a part of this, he declared. If you got us into something illegal, Jack, that's your problem. Griffin, Jack shouted. You know I would never have done this. We've all been victims of Gerard. But Griffin wasn't listening. He stormed out of the room, leaving the rest in tense silence. Morgan sighed. What now? She asked. We keep going, Jack said firmly. With or without his help. I'm not letting Gerard destroy what we've built over the years. Meanwhile, Gerard sat in his office, reviewing the final details of the incriminating material. His phone rang, and he answered without taking his eyes off the monitor. They gathered, said the voice on the other end. But Griffin, as you expected, isn't supporting Jack. Gerard smiled. Everything is going according to plan, he said. Now it's just a matter of waiting for them to start tearing each other apart. Blake was sitting in his modest office when his desk phone emitted a short ping. He instinctively reached for it, thinking it was another reminder or a message from a client. But what he saw made his heart skip a beat. On the screen were the words, "The incriminating material has already been released. The first clients have received their copies. You have a few hours to fix this." The message was anonymous, with no sender information. Blake felt cold sweat run down his back. He quickly dialed Jack's number. "We need to talk," he said when Jack answered. "What happened?" Jack asked, his voice tense. "It's bad. I just got a message. The incriminating material is already being circulated among your clients." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Jack exhaled sharply. "Where are you?" "I'm coming." Half an hour later, Jack burst into Blake's office. He looked exhausted, but determination burned in his eyes. "Show me," he said. Blake handed him the phone. Jack read the message several times, as if trying to find some clue in it. "Who could have sent this?" he asked, his voice tight. "I don't know," Blake replied. "But if it's true, we need to act immediately. Who's first on the list of your key clients?" Jack thought for a moment, then suddenly raised his head. "Jonathan Lawrence. He's our biggest investor. If he believes this lie." Blake nodded. "We need to get to him first." Are you sure he hasn't received it yet? No, Jack replied. But we need to hurry. Jack and Blake arrived at Lawrence's office within an hour. The receptionist tried to stop them, but Jack, ignoring her protests, stormed into the office. Lawrence looked up from his desk, appearing surprised. What's going on here? He asked. Jonathan, I need to talk to you, Jack began. This concerns the information you may have received about my company. Lawrence frowned. If you mean the file that was sent to me this morning, then yes, I've seen it. Jack froze. So it was true. The dirt was already out. It's a lie, he said sharply. All of it is fabricated data designed to destroy me. Lawrence looked at him intently. And how can you prove that? Blake, who had been silent until now, finally intervened. We know who's behind this. We have evidence showing that Gerard created these files, he said. But we need time to piece everything together. Lawrence nodded, but his face remained impassive. Fine, he said at last. You have 24 hours. If you don't provide me with convincing evidence, I'll have to cut all ties with your company. Jack felt his heart sink. 24 hours. It was disastrously little. We'll do everything we can, he said through gritted teeth. You won't regret it. As they left Lawrence's office, Blake stopped and put a hand on Jack's shoulder. We have very little time, he said, but we need to focus. First, we find the source of how this was spread. Second, we gather all possible evidence against Gerard. Jack nodded, though his head was spinning. He felt as if the whole world was turning against him again. But this time, he wasn't going to give up. Jack sat in his office, staring at the documents scattered across his desk. His thoughts swung between fear and fury. He knew Gerard wouldn't stop, but he hadn't expected the next blow to be aimed directly at his family. The phone rang, and Jack immediately picked up. On the other end was Blake. Jack, we have a problem, he began. Gerard has gone beyond business. He's digging into your family. Jack felt a chill inside. What do you mean? He asked. He's found something about Megan, Blake replied. And it looks like he's planning to use it to completely destroy you. Jack stood abruptly, his heart pounding like a drum. What exactly has he found? I don't know yet, Blake said, but we need to act immediately. I met with one of his people, and they talked about some serious attack. It might be something personal. Jack slammed the phone down on the desk and rushed out of his office. He needed to find Megan. She was at home, sitting in the living room with a cup of tea. Her face was tense, and worry shone in her eyes. Megan, we need to talk, Jack began, sitting down beside her. She looked at him, her eyes glistening with tears. What's happened? She asked. Gerard, he said simply. He's planning something against us. Against you. What could it be? Megan shook her head. I don't know, she said, but I feel it's connected to when I worked for him. Maybe he found something I didn't notice back then. Then we need to act. We can't let him destroy everything. Blake got in touch later that day. He reported that Gerard was preparing to release a series of publications exposing Megan's secrets and fabricated accusations against their family. Jack and Megan knew they were running out of time. We can stop this, Blake said, but we need access to his servers. If we can get evidence that this is all fake, we'll win. Jack, Megan, and Blake joined forces. They managed to infiltrate Gerard's digital network, where they found not only the dirt but also evidence of his years of crimes. They handed it over to the police, and by the next morning, Gerard was arrested. But even after that, Jack couldn't feel true relief. Too much deceit and betrayal lingered in their marriage. Could he and Megan start over with a clean slate? Was Jack's fight for the truth justified? What would you have done in his place? Should he have forgiven Megan?